which had a certain arrow or a certain symbol on it, and then another building which had a lot more money or a lot more grandeur would have a totally different symbol. And so he then went on to explain that the arrow then pointing down was fellow craft. And then the next one on was the flat line, the straight parallel line, with 3 lines, like an arrow, pointing down towards it. And this was in connection with being invested into being a master mason.
Okay.
And then the last symbol, which was actually the first one that I was talking about, which you find on the Victoria Art Gallery, which you find on the main abbey, the cathedral in the centre, which you'll find on all of the Masonic lodges and most of the other monuments and main constructions within the city, is this main symbol which I've been talking about.
Yeah.
And this is the mark of the accepted Master Mason. So he's gone through the Master Mason's degree, and he's then open to go into the Holy Royal Arch and all of the other higher degrees. So within this symbol, you kind of had this point of marking the height and the orientation of the building, mapping the height of it compared to the land. It also had what level the architect was at, if he was a Freemasonic architect.
Right.
It showed what level he was at. But also, as I looked into it more, I realised that the ones that were on the abbeys and the larger buildings were much bigger. So, again, I spoke to this professor, and he was kind enough to inform me that, and this was the hunch that I'd already had, was that the size of this symbol on the cornerstone was proportionate with the building.
Really?
It's quite obvious for me explaining it.
Yeah.
But most people had never even thought about this aspect of it. Most people hadn't even seen the symbols in the first place.
Of course, yeah.
And so what he explained to me was that it actually did show you within the size and the ratio of this symbol the overall ratio used in the building. So within this one little marking on the cornerstone, which most people miss, it tells you the map area, the sort of tomography, the height at which you are from sea level. It tells you the level of the master mason. And it tells you also the ratio and the proportion of the building which he's employed. So architects and surveyors and all these people who would know about this subject could at a later point come and inspect the building and look at that symbol and gain quite a lot of insight just from looking at one little part of the corner of it.
Yeah, wow, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And this is probably a system that has been used for a long time then. But I mean, I've never seen the symbol before. Do you think that these are prominent, in other cities, or does this just apply to what's going on in Bath? Do you know?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of because Bath was such, as I make a point of on the blog, and I hope that people do really have a look around some of the pictures of the city. It was considered so highly by most architects and royals from all over Europe that there's always been these very powerful heritage societies in Bath making sure that the buildings were well maintained. So a lot of buildings that would have been taken down in other cities haven't been in Bath. They've been kept up, and they've been kept in their previous condition as much as they could be. So what you find in a lot of cities, and also I saw on your slideshow of the London pictures, had these small metal kind of circular things in the ground.
Yeah.
There was one which was marking the walkway for Diana, the memorial walkway.
Yeah.
And those metal pointers are actually, if you looked up what that's called, it's a benchmark.
Really?
So they're actually they're kind of the modern usage of these Masonic cornerstones, which were then used as benchmarks. Obviously, a lot of these carvings and what you find around Bath as well, as an example, a lot of these stones have been chipped, been hit by a carriage over the years, or gradually kind of worn away.
Yeah.
So obviously, learning from your past, they change these benchmarks, these markers, to metal.
Right.
So that they wouldn't lose the mark, they wouldn't lose the point. And so, you find all around Washington, D.C., and most of these newer cities that came, anywhere from sort of 1740 onwards, around the rest of the Western world, they usually use metal ones.
Mm.
And yeah, you'll see them a lot of places, just in front of town halls and things like that. And
yeah.
if you were a surveyor, you could go straight to that point, whack up your equipment, and get lots of readings about the cities just from having that reference point.
Because also I guess that this could be even connected with navigation to some extent, because this reminds me when I looked at some of those that you mentioned that we had up on our site about the different walkways. I mean, some of them looks basically like a compass rose, that navigation's used in the olden days, as it were,
Yeah, absolutely.
And
the tomography of the land was very much connected to knowing where your borders were and knowing where your coastline was. So
exactly.
It's all very much part and parcel of charting the seas and the land at the same point.
Yeah. And so much of this seems to be about just the surveying and also navigation, of course. We had the London Stone, for instance, up there, and that allegedly was something that the Romans used to measure every single point in Britain from that central area,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's very much
I do think that was connected to something very, very true, because you do find, even outside Bath, I've seen them, or outside Bristol, kind of 5 miles from the city, up on a road somewhere, there's a little stone marker, and it's actually got a little arrow on it saying 5 miles to Bath.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you see these all over the place, so I don't doubt that at all.
Right. Fascinating. So you can tell that much, but just these small little, well, I mean, again, it's in the details, that's for sure,
Yeah. One line makes all the difference.
Exactly, and the angle of the line, and that's fascinating. So, but do you know then if there are exactly replicas of this particular symbol in other cities as well? Do you know?
I've got all the interest, and I have a keen eye, and I have some sort of background as well on the subject, but I don't have huge amounts of money to travel around the world.
Yeah, right.
What I have done is gone around the southwest of England, and I found them all the way down as far as Cornwall, right at the bottom of the coast, on churches by the coast and things.
Yeah.
So I think possibly that they're more of a British thing, maybe connected with the sort of the early Ugal, the Grand Lodge of England.
United Grand Lodge, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think possibly it was a classification used by the Freemasonic brethren within the Grand Lodge of England, perhaps, and that they used different types of markings in other cities around Europe, and also in America especially. I mean, they use these metal benchmarks.
Right.
So it seems like that every country has a version of it.
Right.
If you look for it, you will find it. But because of the preservation of a lot of places in Bath from that period when they were built, and the sort of kind of very conservative, almost, being very sticklerish about the details and keeping it as it was, means that we've got a lot of evidence of the original markings still around the UK.
That's interesting, because some houses are of course preserved in different ways. We have organizations that are, as you say, into preserving as much as possible of certain houses, but in many cases, unfortunately, this is something that is taken down eventually or whatever, and they're going to they have their GPS surveying methods nowadays, So.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, this is interesting also in regards to different architectural styles then, because do you know if these symbols only can be found on certain types of buildings, meaning that there's so many different styles, classifications of different houses and architectural style, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and how that connects with the Neoplatonic era, basically.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you can look around any city in the world. The biggest telltale sign is if you look at the actual government centre buildings and the banks, and usually the stock exchange. Those three in particular. and you will find this same use of columns, the same use of large squashed down triangular pediments that they placed on top of the columns at the front of it. So you have this replica of this Roman or Greco temple. And you find this literally all around the world. But during my research into Bath, some of the most interesting architects of the city, I mean, they were all using this Georgian proportion, but the best buildings, or the most respected, are what are called the Palladian buildings.
Right.
Done in this very particular style, which was kind of made famous by a guy called Andreas Palladio, who came from Rome and sort of moved to Venice and moved back and forth all over the place. But he was very much in demand by the wealthiest of the Roman Empire's families for building villas for them. And so he brought this style through. It was already called the Palladian style before him.
Yeah.
And he actually, the reason that he enjoyed the style so much was because his name was connected to it. So, kind of a synchronistic kind of connection for him, which gave him this obsession with this style of architecture.
That's interesting.
But it was very much kind of a Renaissance period for that architecture.
Yeah.
Because they'd gone through all these periods of kind of very simplified, no details, or sort of moving into this Middle Ages and Gothic period, and they'd moved away from the classical buildings. And so with Palladio and some of his sort of contemporaries of the time, they brought back this style, which was the ratio and the columns, the pediments, all of these different aspects that we consider when we look at kind of the Temple of Apollo.
Yeah.
Or even the temple in Baalbek. These same huge columns and the same squashed down triangular pediment, this kind of section which sits on front of the front columns in the front of the temple.
Yeah.
And so all of these architects were bringing this style back. But Palladio, possibly just because of his name as well, you say, I've got a Palladian house by Palladio. Maybe that had a bit of ring to it,
Of course, yeah.
But he was brought in by the Venetians, and in particular the Venetians, and built huge townhouses and incredible townhouses and villas. And at that point, obviously, other authors have talked about Venice and their connection to sort of the greasing of the oil of the wheels in between various countries.
Of course.
They were real politicians, ambassadors. These are the sort of the viceroys and these sort of characters. And so wherever they went and they set up their little area where they had their embassy, they would always use this same type of Palladian architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And so because these guys were so wealthy, the ones that came from these Roman families that were moving around Europe, and the grand pilgrimage, the Vatican and St. Peter's and Rome was still very much a fundamental part of the kind of the travels or the journeyman's travel around Europe.
Mm-hmm.
They all wanted to emulate this style and utilize this Palladian style. So it kind of, the first ever time we hear anybody talking about this Palladian style is actually Pythagoras. And he says that after going and training with the Egyptians, that he came back and brought with him this understanding of ratios, what's now known as stereometry.
Right.
Which is the kind of the 3D proportions that you gain from actual objects in space rather than things drawn down.
Right.
Elucidean space, which obviously is very connected to the whole Freemasonic doctrine.
Of course, yeah.
Of the Pythagorean triangle,
Yeah.
The 47th proposition of elucid, it's also known as. This is very, very key to all of their ideas.